Good evening, friends. I'm Christopher M. Michaud, and this is the Canadianist Podcast. Thank you for joining us on today's episode. We're diving into something that almost never makes it into everyday conversation, but sits right at the center of Canada's trade relationship with the United States. Canada's supply management system. If you've heard it mentioned lately, it's usually in the context of trade disputes. American negotiators criticize it. Canadian governments defend it. Farmers depend on it. Consumers feel it in their grocery bills. So let's slow this down. What's supply management? Why do we have it? When did it start? What was it supposed to do? What does it actually do? Who benefits? Who pays? And most importantly, is there a centrist path forward that protects Canadian farmers while easing tensions with the United States? Let's start at the beginning. Supply management was introduced in the early 1970s. At the time, Canadian dairy, poultry, and egg farmers were dealing with wild price swings. Overproduction one year, shortages the next. Farmers were going bankrupt. Rural communities were unstable. The federal government stepped in and created a system designed to bring predictability. The model rests on three pillars. First, production quotas. Farmers are given the right to produce a certain amount. That prevents oversupply. Second, price setting. Prices are calculated to reflect the cost of production, so farmers earn a stable, predictable income. Third, import controls. High tariffs are placed on foreign dairy, chicken, and eggs to prevent cheaper imports from undercutting Canadian producers. That's the system in plain language. And what was it supposed to do? It was supposed to stabilize farm incomes. It was supposed to ensure domestic food security. It was supposed to protect small and medium-sized family farms from the volatility of global commodity markets. In many ways, it's done exactly that. Canadian dairy farmers, for example, don't rely on heavy government subsidy checks the way many American farmers do. Instead of taxpayers funding farm bailouts, Canadian consumers pay slightly higher prices at the grocery store. The costs built into the system. But here's where it becomes controversial, because those higher prices are real. Canadian consumers often pay more for milk, cheese, butter, and chicken than Americans do. Critics argue that the system limits competition, discourages innovation, and makes food less affordable, especially for lower-income families. And then there's the international dimension. The United States has long argued that Canada's high tariffs on dairy imports, sometimes exceeding 200%, block American farmers from accessing the Canadian market. During NAFTA renegotiations and later the CUSMA talks, supply management became a major sticking point. From Washington's perspective, it looks like protectionism. From Ottawa's perspective, it looks like sovereignty. Now let's zoom in. Who does this affect in Canada? At the top level, it affects processors, distributors, and retailers. But the real heart of the system lies with local farmers. A dairy farm in rural Ontario, Quebec, or Alberta operates differently because of supply management. That farmer's purchase quota, sometimes worth millions of dollars. That quota represents security. It guarantees that if they produce within their allotment, they'll receive a stable price. If the system were dismantled overnight, quota values would collapse. Farm incomes would drop sharply. Many family farms could fail. Rural communities would feel that shock immediately. Equipment suppliers, veterinarians, feed companies, local banks, everyone connected to that ecosystem would feel it. So this isn't abstract policy, it's livelihoods. But on the other side, Canadian families at the grocery store also feel the system. A few extra dollars here, a few extra dollars there, week after week. For some households, that matters deeply. So we've got a classic Canadian dilemma: stability versus affordability, protection versus competition, sovereignty versus trade harmony. The United States wants greater access to our market. They argue their farmers are efficient and competitive. Canada argues that food security and rural stability are legitimate national interests. And here's where we need to avoid the shouting, because this isn't about choosing between being pro-farmer or pro-consumer. It's about designing policy that recognizes both. A centrist approach doesn't mean tearing the system down. It also doesn't mean pretending it's untouchable. What might compromise look like? It could mean gradual, predictable increases in import access rather than sudden shocks. It could mean compensation programs for farmers if quotas are devalued through negotiated changes. It could mean creating innovation incentives so Canadian producers can become more competitive over time. It could mean transparency in pricing. so consumers understand what they're paying for and why. And it absolutely means honesty. If we defend supply management, we should say clearly why. If we reform it, we should say clearly who will be protected during that transition. Trade relationships with the United States aren't optional. They're foundational to our economy. At the same time, rural Canada isn't expendable. A serious government doesn't pit one against the other. It prepares, then it negotiates from strength, thus protecting its people while acknowledging the economic reality. Here's the bigger question. What's the purpose of economic policy in 2026 Canada? Is it simply to maximize short-term consumer savings? Is it to preserve rural livelihoods at any cost? Or is it to build a balanced system that shares both responsibility and opportunity? Supply management was created in a different era when globalization was less intense and trade disputes were less politically charged. The world's changed. That doesn't automatically mean the system's wrong, but it does mean it should be examined honestly, calmly, and without ideology. Because in the end, the goal isn't to make Americans happy at Canada's expense, and it isn't to ignore legitimate trade concerns out of reflexive nationalism. The goal is stability, fairness, and prosperity for Canadians, all Canadians, from the dairy farmer milking cows at 5 a.m. to the single parent buying groceries on a tight budget. This is exactly the kind of issue that demands a Canadianist approach. Not left, not right, not slogans, just practical problem solving. So I'll leave you with this. If reform's coming, how should we design it so rural communities aren't sacrificed? And if we keep the system largely intact, how do we justify the cost to consumers and our trading partners? Those are questions worth debating seriously. Remember to check out thecanadianist.news for all the top stories from across Canada, and like and subscribe to the show. It helps us continue producing engaging content. And if you're interested in knowing more about the United Canadian Centrists, visit uccparty.ca. There you can download our free ebook titled The Case for Canadianism that spells out who we are and our vision. I'm Christopher M. Michaud. I'm a Canadianist. And if this resonates with you, I invite you to continue the conversation at thecanadianist.news.